Partisanship in the Media by Henry Ferguson. On July 10th, 2016, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "The media is so dishonest. If I make a statement, they twist it and turn it to make it sound bad or foolish. They think the public is stupid." Unquote. On August 10th, 2016, Trump's campaign released a statement titled, "Trump's Campaign Statement on Dishonest Media." The statement itself had nothing to do with media dishonesty, but rather the statement clarified some remarks the candidate made during a speech about gun control. Both of these statements were made due to Trump's feeling that his words have been twisted and misrepresented by a so-called liberal media machine run by Hillary Clinton, hell-bent on ruining his campaign. In general, a two-step process exists between political figures and the media. The pattern goes as follows. Public figures make a statement, and the media reports on said statement. The Trump campaign has added a third step, firing back at the media. Throughout his campaign, Trump has repeatedly stated that the media is out to get him and reports in favor of his opponent, Hillary Clinton. Most Americans, Republican or Democrat, would agree with Trump's statement that the media is in fact biased. A recent Gallup poll taken in 2014 found that 40% of Americans were not confident in the media's ability to fully accurately or fairly report news. This distrust is not a recent phenomenon either. Since the late 90s, a pattern of lowered trust in media bias has emerged. But is this really the truth? Are media outlets inherently biased towards one group or another, and is there substantial proof to back this claim? After all, most people would agree that Donald Trump's statements are not usually entirely accurate, and his tendency to overlook details is well known. In addition, national polls tend to lose some of their merit when sample size, demographics, and other factors come into play. This paper seeks to answer the question of media bias through an analysis of quantitative data from a variety of academic studies dedicated to this question. This paper will focus on proving that bias exists more prevalently in the media's reporting of international rather than domestic events using two major news outlets, CNN and Fox Television News, as sources. This paper's goal is not to simply prove that biases exist in the media, that much has already been proven, but rather that the media is easily more able to influence people's perception of foreign rather than domestic events. The origins of political media trace back to the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Caesar placed his head on Roman currency in a genius move to assure that all his Roman subjects, from Rome to Jerusalem, knew that he was the emperor. In effect, Caesar created the first form of world news. He was able to assure that all Roman citizens, but more importantly the foreign ones outside of Rome, got to know their emperor. After all, the first step in ruling a country is assuring people know the face of the person in power. Fast forward 2 millennia to the United States in the modern era. Political media exists in many forms, and news outlets convey it over many mediums. In the last century, 3 landmark changes are noted in the way people receive their news. First, the transition from print-only and public speeches to radio made politicians and news people appear more personable and changed the way that the public perceived them and that they directly were able to communicate with them in their homes. Television brought with it another change. It merged the intimacy of radio with the importance of body language and appearance. In 2016, social media and the internet forced a complete overhaul of the news process. Rather than people receiving their news at set times throughout the day, people now receive their news in a constant stream and from multiple sources. Today, political media exists in all of these forms, but the form of communication that people most utilize for receiving their news is via television. In 2014, an American press study found that 40% of Americans receive their news from multiple sources throughout the day, and that 87% of Americans utilize the television to receive this news, followed by the internet and computer at 69%. The same study asked which method people preferred the most, and television came in first at 24%. They also found that 60% of Americans preferred receiving their news from direct sources, such as CNN and Fox News. The question of bias in the media is an issue that stirs up trouble in many circles. Both liberals and conservatives alike believe the media is positioned against their beliefs. The issue remains extremely complex, and its causes are not always clear. One study states that perceptions of media biases are rooted in people's own beliefs and personal experiences. This would make some sense of why liberals and conservatives alike point fingers at each other and are able to say with personal certainty that the media is unfairly biased against them. As found in a survey, conservatives tend to believe that there is a liberal bias in the media, while liberals tend to believe that there is a conservative bias. While many would simply conclude that bias is in the eye of the beholder, the researcher makes an astute point that the individuals are more likely to claim bias the further the slant of the story is from their own personal views. For these reasons, the question of bias in domestic news stories can become entirely subjective, with both sides screaming bias at the other and founding these claims in personal belief and experience. It becomes hard to discern if the media is truly biased, and if so, against whom. Shifting the view from domestic to international news simplifies things a bit, while at the same time raising the potential for bias that comes directly from the media. While people tend to create their own lenses of what is going on domestically and allow personal experience to influence their perspective of domestic news, international news often remains uncolored. News outlets have a certain amount of control over the information about the world that viewers see. News outlets such as CNN and Fox serve as filters for the massive amount of activity going on in the world on a day-to-day basis. One author describes the role of the media as such, as an effective flow of information between the various distinct groups of people in the public sphere has historically been made possible by the mass media, while systematically editing and interpreting the mass of information, making some sense of the world for audiences. Thus, the media exists as a barrier to information overload, selecting what they think is important and essential for people to view. The media employs a variety of tactics to influence its viewers. These methods are by no means a secret. These methods were first directly connected to shaping people's world and political views in 1997, when Republican publicist Frank Luntz released a 222-page memo with a simple message. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. The memo went on to state how the content of a message was less important than how it was presented to specific audiences. The rest of the memo went on to focus less on gathering all of the details of a story and focus more on how it could be made more appealing to viewers. The media today exists as a private entity bound to the rules of capitalism, and capitalism favors the consumer and demand. We do not live in a country with a state-run media after all. Multiple studies have proven that people tend to view news outlets more that align with their own beliefs rather than those that conflict with them. Thus, news outlets tend to tailor their story to their audience. Quote-unquote conservative outlets spin stories to appeal to conservative viewers, and quote-unquote liberal outlets for liberal viewers. As a result, media effects tend to be much more complex in nature, and tend to result from people's own homogeneous networks and selected informational diets which reinforce their pre-existing views rather than changing them. But where do views on foreign matters originate from then? Unless a person goes abroad and experiences something firsthand, their source for their views would come from a mix of personal morals and beliefs. Thus, the bulk of a person's information comes from media sources. It can safely be said for issues such as terrorism that the majority of Americans have not experienced it directly. As a result, their views on such a topic would largely rely on the reporting done by the media. The three main methods used by the media are agenda setting, priming, and framing. Agenda setting refers to the idea that there is a strong correlation between the emphasis the media places on a topic and the importance attributed to an issue by an audience. One example of this would be the coverage of recent terrorist attacks around the world. Media outlets, especially CNN and Fox News, have come under fire for covering terrorist attacks in Europe more heavily than terrorist attacks in the Middle East. The reason for this is simple. It boils down to empathy. Basically, when attacks happen in Paris or Brussels, many people in the developed world can easily imagine themselves becoming a victim. They can see themselves watching a concert in France or boarding a train in Belgium. When people can identify with something, they feel a connection. This translates to more viewership, and primetime news needs viewers to keep the ship afloat. After all, CNN's primetime news channel makes up only about 10% of the company, but accounts for a good chunk, around 40% of their advertising revenue. This holds true across the board. Primetime across all television networks, not just CNN, is still the most valuable real estate for media companies and advertisers because of its reach and the ease of monetizing it. Priming occurs when news outlets suggest benchmarks for evaluating certain situations. For example, the media constantly references 9/11 as a benchmark for terrorist attacks abroad. Rather than treating cases as individual accounts with their own situations, it is easier to reference something that people are familiar with. This leads to misunderstanding and simplifications of situations. Framing differs significantly from priming and agenda setting. It is based on the assumption that how an issue is characterized in news reports can have an influence on how audiences understand information. This is the method that I will focus on for the rest of my paper. The idea behind framing is simple and explains how different media sources, in this case CNN and Fox, can take an event and spin it to appeal to both liberals and conservatives alike. The resulting effect leads to people seeing foreign media as inherently biased. An assumption of framing lies in the idea that people cannot fully understand the world around them, both due to lack of personal experience and an abundance of available information. In an attempt to help people understand new information, news outlets will tailor stories to fit into a framework of what people are able to understand easily. After all, the Evening News is not an academic research paper. Researchers state this about framing. Quote, "This does not mean, of course, that most journalists try to spin a story or attempt to deceive their audiences. In fact, framing for them is a necessary tool to reduce the complexity of an issue, given the constraints of their respective media related to news holes and airtime." Unquote. Framing is a necessary tool in news, but it can also be used as a biasing tool. In 2011, a peaceful protest began in Egypt against the semi-authoritarian President Hosni Mubarak. This protest received a good amount of media coverage in the United States due to our special relationship with the Egyptian government. During this coverage, the media speculated on who would come to power and what would happen if certain groups emerged as the new government. One such group was the Muslim Brotherhood. However, a different picture of the Muslim Brotherhood was painted to viewers depending on which news outlet a person received their news from. When examining the depictions of the Muslim Brotherhood from Fox News and CNN, an astute viewer could discern an obvious bias in the reporting. Using a framing analysis, one can clearly see this bias. Researchers subsequently conducted a study examining the framing methods used by both CNN and Fox, and found that both CNN and Fox framed the Muslim Brotherhood as a radical Islamic terrorist group, and that Fox consistently used rhetoric that would frame the Muslim Brotherhood for conservatives, while CNN framed the Brotherhood for liberal viewers. Between the two networks, 45 instances of co-occurrence were noted, with the words coded as describing the Muslim Brotherhood as, quote, radical, and the words coded because they associate the Brotherhood with terrorism. For example, Sean Hannity of The Sean Hannity Show on Fox News described the Brotherhood as a real, clear, and present danger and the only organized political opposition. I think the odds are that radicals, maybe not immediately, but over time, they will sound moderate and it will become radical Islam. On CNN, it was stated that the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt's future were similar to the Iranian Revolution, a historically violent revolution. There was also evidence on Fox that the news was framed as coverage for conservative viewers. Of those 45 co-occurrences of coded words falling under, quote, radical and, quote, association with terrorism in the same paragraph, Fox News accounted for 30 or 3/4 of those co-occurrences. Additionally, Fox News routinely discussed the Muslim Brotherhood as the enemy of democracy, while CNN provided a slightly more moderate comment and discussion of the Muslim Brotherhood amongst its Islamic democracy naysayers and reporting. Moreover, Fox News averaged nearly 96 associations of the Muslim Brotherhood with terrorism per every transcript, where CNN averaged only about 35 associations for every 100 transcripts. Both groups failed as a whole to address the situation in its full complexity, and failed to go into detail about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood or its political platform. Rather, they took what people already knew about politics in the Middle East and tailored the story to that. While I cannot say with certainty which news outlet gave the right side of the story, I can say this. Without an in-depth and comprehensive look at a situation, it is impossible to discern where the truth lies. This is the responsibility of the viewer. The media, like many things, is a commodity in this world. And with all commodities, we the consumer hold intrinsic responsibility to be responsible consumers and hold news outlets accountable to deliver reliable information. In the coming weeks, I will undertake my own research into the framing of media stories. I will use similar research methods to that of the University of Oxford in their evaluation of media sources. I plan to read through the transcripts of the coverage of the Turkish coup, both on Fox and CNN. My hypothesis is that a similar trend will emerge to the study mentioned above about the Egyptian Revolution, that Fox framed the story in a more conservative manner, while CNN framed it in a more liberal manner.